Right, fantastic. I think I can see the sort of numbers have leveled off, so thank you very much. So thank you very much for joining us this morning for this Muscular Dystrophy UK Muscles Matter 2021 online seminar looking at Becker Muscular Dystrophy, which of course is taking place in Becker Muscular Dystrophy Awareness Week. I'm Rob Burley. I'm Director of Campaigns, Care and Support at Muscular Dystrophy UK, and it's my pleasure to be chairing the session overall. So building on the success of our 2020 series and having taken feedback into account, the Muscles Matter seminars have become a regular feature in our calendar at MDUK. They're not going to permanently replace our physical events when we're able to host those again, but I think we're certainly going to continue to embrace the virtual events because they've been a popular part of our information offer. We're running 2 or 3 seminars a month, and they focus on a range of general and condition-specific topics. And they include sessions that you've told us you found the most useful on things like research and practical and financial support. I think we're over halfway through now, so the majority of sessions are now available on the website to view as recordings, as well as booking for the future sessions. Our helpline remains available to anyone who's affected by muscle wasting conditions, and so do please contact us if you have any questions or are in need of any support. We can help you with information, and we can either support you directly or point you to where you can get the support you need from. So the number and email address should be on the screen now, and you can call us on 0800 652 6352, or you can email us through info@musculardystrophyuk.org. We're really grateful to be joined by an expert panel covering a very broad range of expertise on Becker muscular dystrophy today. And we're also very grateful for the support of our sponsors this morning, who are PTC Therapeutics and Roche. We're splitting the session into 2 parts, and we'll begin by looking at research, and then we'll move on to exploring living with and managing Becker muscular dystrophy. So before we begin, a note on how you can ask questions or make comments throughout the session. So we've had some questions in advance, and we'll seek to cover those later, but we'd also like to incorporate some live input. And to do that, we're using the Q&A function, which you should be able to see at the bottom of the screen. So please type your question or comment, and we'll feed that into the discussion. To help us manage the technical side of the event, we won't be calling on questioners to ask their questions directly. And any questions we don't manage to cover or we don't know the answers to, we'll come back to you either through the website or by email afterwards. And finally, a reminder that we're recording the session and it will be made available over the next few days. So to start us off this morning, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, Dr. John Copier, who will introduce our research speaker and then chair that part of this morning's session. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker this morning. Dr. Federico Montenarro started her career with a PhD studying neurobiology at McGill University in Canada and gained her doctorate in 1999. She subsequently did postdoctoral work at the Harvard Medical School and Ohio State University, where she studied muscle regeneration and proteins involved in the function of heart and other muscles. Since 2016, she's been a senior lecturer at the Dubovitz Neuromuscular Center at the Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health. Her current research aims to understand underlying principles of how microdystrophin works in heart muscles and processes associated with heart failure in the absence of dystrophin. This morning, Dr. Montanaro will give us a research update on Becker muscular dystrophy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Federica for her talk.
John, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I have only about 15 minutes to give you a research update on Becker muscular dystrophy, so I need to move a little bit fast, but please do feel free to ask questions at the end, and I can go on some of the topics in more detail if you're interested. So if I may have the next question, the next slide, sorry. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on 3 areas of research that are on these slides, and the smaller points just give you what the relevance is or what the importance is. The first one is ways of visualizing and measuring the disease status as well as disease progression in patients with Becker muscular dystrophy. A lot of this information is starting to trickle through because of natural history studies that were started about 5 years ago. 2 of them, one on skeletal muscle, the other one focusing more on the heart. So there's starting to be papers coming up. These natural history studies are usually long, And therefore, these data are starting to come now into the published field. The second area is how do we model Becker muscular dystrophy in a laboratory setting using animals and cells. This has been a real challenge, but it's something that we really need to address in order to be able to study disease mechanism, identify new treatments, and test treatments. And the third part is something that I'm much more familiar with and my lab works on, and that is trying to understand how the genetic mutations affect the function of dystrophin in both skeletal and cardiac muscles. And the idea here is to try to maximize the information that we can get out of the genetic diagnosis that a patient receives and provide more personalized information about what can be expected in the future for the disease, but also looking at what kind of treatments might work. And this research is also going to provide us with more information about disease mechanisms. The next slide, please. So starting with how we visualize disease, magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, has been emerging as a very, very important tool and very good tool to study disease processes as well as disease progression directly in patients. This has been used extensively now in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and so several protocols have been developed in order to be able to accurately measure and quantify the accumulation of fat and scar tissue in both skeletal and cardiac muscles. And in particular, in the heart, we can see by MRI scarring of the cardiac tissue well in advance of the patients displaying losses in function. And so this has been particularly useful in early intervention with cardiac drugs. In addition, for Becker muscular dystrophy, there are new protocols for MRI that are now starting to be developed and tested, because in Becker muscular dystrophy, the issue is not simply a loss of muscle to fat and scar tissue, but also about the quality of this muscle, because different mutations affect muscle force generation and function in different ways. And so people are now starting to ask as to whether MRI can be tweaked and developed to not only look at differences in muscle quantity, but also differences in muscle quality, and how this will better correlate with muscle force measurements, specifically in Becker muscular dystrophy patients. And I'm giving you examples here of 3 different papers and studies that have recently come out. 2 of them, I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer that I can use, I think of, but 2 of them show you the optimization and implementation of different protocols for Becker muscular dystrophy patients in the heart and the skeletal muscle. And then the one on the bottom right is more a longitudinal study, so looking at how MRI measurements and during disease progression. May I have the next one, please? There are additional protocols that were developed to measure disease progression and trajectory in Duchenne patients that are now being applied to look at Becker muscular dystrophy and disease progression in Becker muscular dystrophy patients. These are protocols to more accurately measure muscle force, as well as different devices that have been developed for this goal, as well as changes in respiratory function. And in particularly the study that I have down at the bottom, looking at respiratory decline in Becker muscular dystrophy patients, has been trying to correlate changes in respiratory function with loss of ambulation, has found that upon loss of ambulation, respiratory function decline accelerates. In addition, there are other measurements of disease and as well as tracking of particular parameters that have been developed in DMD for looking at biopsies that are now being applied to biopsies of patients with Becker muscular dystrophy. In particular, very sensitive methods of quantifying the level of dystrophin expression and how this changes between different muscle types and over time in biopsies. And this information is very important because we're starting to be able to see how patients harboring different types of genetic mutations, what the effect of this is on the expression of dystrophin. Next slide, please. Modeling Becker muscular dystrophy is a huge challenge because not only there are multiple mutations that are present in patients, but this translates into a range of phenotypes from mild to quite severe. And therefore, if we want to model this in animals, we almost have to generate one animal to model each person. So we need to generate a lot of different animal models. This is very expensive, very time consuming to characterize all of these models. The preferred model is usually a mouse because it's cheap and relatively easy to genetically manipulate. But this is not an ideal model for Becker muscular dystrophy because the mouse model of Duchenne muscular dystrophy has a very, very mild phenotype. And so if we try to model in the mouse a milder Becker muscular dystrophy, we will not be able to measure and really detect disease. Next, please. So we need to go into larger models like the rat, the dog, or the pig. And this causes additional problems of timelines for the studies and cost for the studies. So far, as far as I know, only one model of Becker muscular dystrophy has been created. Next clip, please. And that is a rat. So there's only one rat model that I know of for Becker muscular dystrophy, and this mimics a mutation with a very severe Becker muscular dystrophy phenotype, and the rat is displaying skeletal muscle and cardiac disease mirroring the patient. But in order to be able to better model the diversity of mutations that are found in patients, if I may have the next slide, please. We're now starting to turn and look at, oh, that went too fast. We're now starting to look at the generation of induced pluripotent stem cells. And these are cells that can be derived from patients, from a urine sample, from a blood draw, or from a skin biopsy. So the urine sample in particular is very non-invasive. And these cells can then be generated into a lab, turned into pluripotent stem cells that can be expanded in dishes. And there are now protocols that very effectively can be used to transform these cells or turn these cells into heart cells or skeletal muscle cells, obtaining contracting cardiac cells in a dish and contracting muscle fibers. So we can generate these cells from a variety of patients with individual mutations and look at the effects of those mutations on dystrophin expression, production of force, and the responses of these cells to damage and to stress. We can also interestingly look at the effects of these mutations on the embryonic development of cardiac and skeletal muscle. And we can use these cells to look at treatment responses for individual patients as well as toxicity potentials. Next clip, please. So there is one major challenge at the moment, and that is dystrophin tends to be expressed in a very mature skeletal and cardiac cells primarily. And fully maturing the cells in the dish is still quite challenging, but there are protocols coming up for three-dimensional cultures that better replicate the full organ and are able to push the maturation of cells. So this is coming, and if I may have the next slide, please. Most interestingly now, there are starting to be induced pluripotent stem cell lines being generated from Becker muscular dystrophy patients. There's 3 of them that I know of displayed here. So this is coming up. They're all carrying different mutations. They can be all used to model and understand disease in a dish. These cells are usually stored in biobanks and are then made available for researchers worldwide. And here in the UK, if I may have the next clip, we have one particular biobank, the MSc Centre for Neuromuscular Diseases Biobank in London and in Newcastle, who is collecting cells from skin, urine, and blood that can be turned with patient consent into induced pluripotent stem cells for these studies and can be distributed widely for research purposes. I may have the next slide, please. So as I said, the last topic, and the one I'm most familiar with, has to do with mapping and understanding the effect of mutations on the function of dystrophin. So dystrophin is depicted here as this long rod-shaped protein, and it has multiple domains that I have colored here in multiple colors to sort of highlight them. And these different domains serve different purposes. They bind to different proteins that then perform different functions. One main function of dystrophin is as an anchor, is a structural function, and it provides a link between the cytoskeleton and the cell membrane. And there are two major anchor points that are extremely important in the cell. One is at the very beginning of the protein, depicted in bright orange, and the other one is towards the end of the protein that anchors it to the membrane, that is in as a red square. There are additional anchor sites that appear to be minor anchor sites that have been already mapped on the dystrophin protein. Mutations of those do not appear to give a very strong phenotype at the moment, but they're still being investigated. So mutations in the primary anchor site in the cytoskeleton, if I may have the next clip, can produce a protein that is expressed in muscle, but these mutations usually disrupt this anchor and give rise to severe Becker muscular dystrophy phenotype with early loss of ambulation and early cardiac disease. The mutations in the second anchor point, as far as I know, have not been really associated with Becker muscular dystrophy, but give rise to Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Then I have the next clip, please. Thank you. Thank you. And finally, dystrophin also has signaling functions, and there are two major sites that have been associated with signaling in dystrophin. One in the middle of the protein, and this has been associated with a function in regulating muscle fatigue or preventing muscle fatigue through the release and regulation of nitric oxide. The second signaling place has been found at the very end of the molecule, but it does not appear to be essential for functioning skeletal muscles. So we're using this information and this mapping information of domains and functions on dystrophin to design therapeutics. This has been used to guide the design of microdystrophins for gene therapy trials. It's helping understand the benefits that can be derived from exon skipping approaches by skipping different exons that try to maintain these key functions. And more recently, when we identify signaling pathways, if I may have the next click, we can also identify drugs like Cialis, for example, that can be targeting these specific signaling pathways, like in this case, nitric oxide. So in my laboratory, most of these mapping of functions has been performed for skeletal muscle in dystrophin. If I may have the next section. Thank you. So the research question in my lab that we have been exploring is, why do some mutations primarily or exclusively affect the heart in patients with Becker muscular dystrophy? And we believe that this is because there are domains of dystrophin that are particularly important for cardiac functions that still remain to be identified. Next, please. And next, thank you. So we need to perform a similar study that has been performed in skeletal muscle in cardiac muscle and look at which proteins associate to dystrophin and map where they associate with dystrophin. So identification of the proteins associated with dystrophin in skeletal muscle took about 10 years in the 1990s, and we wanted to accelerate the pace of this. If I may have the next click. So in our group, we have developed a protocol that allows us to take us now less than 10 days to map to discover new protein associations of dystrophin. And so we have looked in the heart. If I may have the next clip, please. And what we have found importantly is that in the heart, dystrophin does not signal through nitric oxide. And it also has additional protein interactions that still need to be characterized and that have not happened in skeletal muscle. Two of these protein interactions, we believe, have anchoring functions, while the others appear to more likely be involved in signaling. So we're now going through and trying to understand what they mean, and we've started with cabin 4, if I may have the next slide. Thank you. So cabin 4 is an interesting muscle protein that interacts with, thank you, with another little guy called Bourke, another protein. And when these two interact together, ERK gets activated and performs several functions. So the first function that it has been ascribed to, if I may have the next clip, please, is in during growth, individual growth. And ERK is important for making sure that our heart grows to the correct size together with our body. And ERK is not the only protein involved in this growth of the heart. There are several other factors, but ERK does play a role in this process. And this makes sure that by the time you reach your adult size, your heart is big enough to function and perfuse properly and circulate blood in your body. The other function that ERK has in an adult, may I have the next clip, please, is to get activated when there is any stress or damage to the heart. And we know that this activation does involve its association with CAVIN4 for sure. And so by stress and damage, I mean something like exercise, continuous strong exercise, or large changes in body size, especially if the person is gaining a lot of weight and now there is a larger area that the blood needs to circulate into, or disease. And these could include Becker muscular dystrophy, but it could also be high blood pressure and chronic high blood pressure. And so in these situations, ERK gets activated again, and it promotes the survival of the cardiac cells, and it increases the strength of the heart. So one of the questions that we have been asking with funding from MDUK is what happens in the case of Becker muscular dystrophy to ERK signaling. If I may have the next clip. And we asked these questions because we have found that CAVIN4 interacts with dystrophin. And so we studied ERK, whether ERK can be activated in a heart that lacks dystrophin and in a heart that expresses a microdystrophin that contains deletions in dystrophin. And we found that ERK is highly impaired and does not get activated when there is damage in a heart where dystrophin expression is impaired or that expresses deleted a form of dystrophin with internal deletions, specific deletions. May I have the next clip, please? So we recently published this research. In addition, we have the next clip. We are also now looking at where exactly CAVIN4 interacts with dystrophin in order to map the interaction site and understand which mutations might disrupt the interaction of CAVIN4 with dystrophin and therefore disrupt ERK function. Can I have the next slide, please? So we have quite a lot of work ahead of us because it's not just CAVIN4 that we need to map, but all of these new proteins that we found associated with dystrophin in the heart. Traditionally, by traditional method, this would take us multiple decades to do. So we are now relying and turning to artificial intelligence. Can we have the next clips? 2 clips, please. So artificial intelligence in recent years has been becoming more and more used and better at predicting how proteins fold. So you can go from give the computer the original sequence of the protein, and it can start to predict how it would fold. So the things we can do with this, if I can have the next 2 clips, please. So my group, in collaboration with Ray and Columbus, has started to use artificial intelligence to model the folding of dystrophin and then model on it how deletions and mutations in dystrophin would affect the structure of dystrophin and scaffolding. And what we're starting to do next is push this even further, if I may have the next clip. And that is to see whether artificial intelligence can now start to be used to predict where 2 proteins might bind. So instead of asking it to look at only 1 protein, we're asking it to take a look at 2 proteins, fold them up correctly, and I may have the next clip, and then tell us whether they can interact, and tell us what that interaction site looks like. Where is it, and how does it need to be folded? If I may have the next clip, please. And then we will use this information to see whether mutations are disrupting the specific folding site and are likely to disrupt the binding of these two proteins. So this is what is coming up in the future and what we're trying to develop artificial intelligence to do. May I have the next slide, please? So as a summary, actually, we now have new laboratory tools that allow us to rapidly identify new protein associations of dystrophin. We are now developing and working with artificial intelligence experts to find ways of rapidly mapping these protein associations on dystrophin and predict the effects that mutations will have. There is a lot of movement happening, a lot of progress happening in modeling Becker muscular dystrophy. Particularly promising are going to be patient cell lines and stem cells that can be produced. And these can be used to test the artificial intelligence predictions and findings in the laboratories and to test then treatment interventions. Information that is key to the design of clinical trials is coming up. It is being collected for Becker muscular dystrophy patients. MRI in particular has been developed and optimized, but a lot of other tools that have been used for Becker muscular dystrophy patients, for Duchenne muscular dystrophy patients are now moving into Becker muscular dystrophy studies. These will be important steps in order to really establish what are the parameters that we need to look at and that we need to measure in order to determine whether a treatment actually works and is efficacious. And so far, I have been telling you about muscle, but I want to tell you that there are new research also looking at the dystrophin in the brain. If I may have the next clip. In particular, our group is involved in BUND, a new EU-funded project for brain involvement in dystrophinopathies, where we are now starting to look at the effects of loss of dystrophin on the brain in both Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy patients. If I may have the next slide, please. I would like to thank you for your attention, and a big thank you to Muscular Dystrophy UK for funding our research and for supporting these two very bright young scientists, Daniel and Eleanor, in the lab. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Federica. So we have a few questions. The first is regarding exon deletion, and you touched briefly on the relationship between exon deletion and severity, but could you perhaps expand a little bit on how exon deletion relates to severity in BMD, and is this going to be a prognostic test in the end to be able to see what kind of exon deletion will relate to the severity of disease in the future for patients?
So I think, so yes, there is a correlation, especially for particular areas that I spoke about when these major anchor points are being touched by mutations and rearranged by these deletions. If they affect the function of the anchor, then naturally there will be a severe effect and a more severe prognosis for the patient. There are always exceptions to the rule. Nothing is really 100%. We think we know a lot, but dystrophin just keeps telling us, no, you don't really know what you're talking about. So this is why we are really highly investigating this area, because ideally we would want to look at the genetic diagnosis that the patient has received and not need to take a muscle biopsy to be able to understand what is happening at the protein level, whether it's expressed or not, and whether it's functioning. So ideally, this is what we're trying to move towards. It is not easy, but we're making inroads. So as I said, any deletion that is affecting this early portion of the protein tends to be really correlating with early loss of ambulation and early cardiac disease. And in a study that we did to review what was in the literature, cardiac disease in these patients tends to start around the age of 25 or on average around the age of 25 years of age. And then there is another area where deletions around exon 45 and 48 and so forth tend to also be associated with an earlier onset of cardiomyopathy. And these are around the age of 35, let's say. But it's not just as simple as looking at where the deletion occurs and saying, oh, when you delete this exon, you always get this particular phenotype. What is important is to figure out how this deletion affects the protein, because some deletions will maintain the structure of the protein intact. They will just make it shorter, but will not really prevent it from folding properly. And so deletions that tend to unfold the protein or change its structure tend to be associated with a more severe or earlier onset of loss of ambulation, of symptoms, and cardiac disease. So this is where the challenge lies now, whereas this artificial intelligence is really needed to help us understand and map how these different mutations change the folding of the protein, the structure of the protein, and how this then affects the function of the has. So I think at this moment in the clinical setting, it's really difficult. And they probably, I know there are several clinicians here, they can say how they use this information, but I don't think that probably in the clinic, one would want to make very strong statements and say, when you have this mutation, you will be fine from cardiac disease, or will develop cardiac disease, or will be losing ambulation or not losing ambulations, and so forth. I think this is something where there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're getting there, and it's accelerating. The pace of research is accelerating for that part.
Fantastic.
I hope
Thank
this
you.
answers the question. I don't know if any of the clinicians on the board would like to add anything.
I'm happy to open the floor to anybody else who wants to make a contribution on that. No, all is silence. Okay, so you talked a little bit about some other proteins that interact with dystrophin, for CAVIN4, and how that impacts on another pathway called ERK. So do those other proteins and other pathways represent druggable targets? Do they represent pathways that might lead to other medications, or is the focus only on dystrophin and how it functions?
So some of them are structural, and therefore it will be difficult for me to say that they would be easily druggable. The signaling ones might be. There isn't something that could activate ERK that would be probably safe to use, because ERK is involved in a lot of different processes in our body, and so I would be very cautious of trying to target directly as a drug. I think we are trying to use this more to, for example, none of the ones that we have found so far, I would say there is a drug that jumps out at me and that I could say, yes, this is going to be an easy target at the moment. Let's put it that way. But we're trying to understand, like if we can map these domains, then that can guide, for example, whether exon skipping would be beneficial, or maybe incorporating those domains into a gene therapy construct that might then better protect the heart. That would be, for example, beneficial to Becker muscular dystrophy patients. Because if they are expressing a dystrophin that lacks domain that are specifically crucial for the heart, but they're still ambulant and the skeletal muscles are working, one might think about, well, maybe they would benefit from adding a gene therapy construct, a microdystrophin that contains those domains that will be able to improve cardiac function.
Thank you very much. And I have a question about progress on future treatments for BMD, which I think I might open up more broadly to other panelists if anybody wants to make a contribution to that. Again, all is silence. Perhaps future treatments for BMD is something that we might cover in a future webinar. I think that is all of the questions that we have posted. So that only remains for me to thank Federica for her contribution this morning. And I'm going to hand on to Rob now, who will introduce the rest of the panelists and take us through the rest of the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, John, and thanks so much, Federica, as well. That was a fantastic sort of session on research. So yeah, I'm really pleased to welcome some more panelists to join us this morning. I'm going to introduce them in turn, and then I'll invite each of them to say a few words about their experience of Becker muscular dystrophy and the support that they provide, and then we'll move into questions and discussion. So a quick reminder that if you have any questions that you'd like to put to the panel, do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll also due to be joined by another panelist shortly as well, but I'll introduce the panelists who are with us now. So delighted to be joined by Professor Tracy Willis, who is a dedicated paediatric neurologist with a special interest in neuromuscular diseases. She is currently the clinical lead in neuromuscular disorders at Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt Orthopaedic Hospital in Birmingham Children's Hospital. Dr. Willis is part of the Northwest Regional Neuromuscular Network and chair of the West Midlands Network since 2017, and is also part of the North Star and SMA Reach networks that set national standards. We will be joined shortly by Dr. Stefen Brady. Professor Willis focuses on paediatric care, and Dr. Stefen Brady will be joining us shortly, and he focuses on adult patients. So he has worked as a specialist neuromuscular consultant since 2016, and since 2019 has been at the Oxford Adult Muscle Service and NHS highly specialised services for rare mitochondrial disorders in Oxford. He studied medicine at Trinity College Medical School in Dublin and trained as a neurology specialist in Yorkshire, and he was awarded a Muscular Dystrophy UK Clinical Fellowship in 2010. Dr. John Bourke is with us. He's a consultant cardiologist at the Department of Cardiology at Freeman Hospital, Newcastle upon Tyne, and is a senior lecturer clinical in Translational and Clinical Research Institute at the Newcastle University as well. John has developed a highly successful dedicated cardiology muscle clinic at Freeman Hospital, providing surveillance and treatment for patients with cardiac involvement related to their neuromuscular disorder. And we heard in the section earlier about the link between Becker and heart complications, so we'll explore that further. And then finally, Heather Ryan is a neuromuscular care advisor working with the team at the John Radcliffe Hospital, Oxford. So Heather commenced nurse training in Oxford in 1988, and then spent on qualifying completed 2 years in general medicine at the John Radcliffe Hospital. Heather then spent 3 years working with patients with spinal injury, and is now and after 5 years is now working in training carers in the community before taking up her current role 6 years ago with the Oxford Service. So thank you very much for joining us, and Stefen, thanks for joining us as well. Before we go to questions, I'd like to sort of start with a question to both Tracy and Stefen. I'll come to Tracy first. So we've heard a lot throughout the Muscle Matters seminars on all conditions about the importance of the multidisciplinary team in providing sort of care and support. So I'd be really interested if you could just spend a couple of minutes just talking us through the elements of support that you and your services provide to people with Becker muscular dystrophy and the various elements that go into helping them sort of live well. And Tracy, if I come to you first to sort of speak about the perspective of children, then come to Stefen to talk about adults.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think, yes, sort of in our multidisciplinary team that we have at Oswestry, we obviously have our sort of clinical nurse specialists, care advisors, psychologists, and our physiotherapists in particular, but we also sort of do our joint clinics with the respiratory team and the cardiology teams. And certainly for Becker muscular dystrophy, whilst in paediatrics, it may not be the severity of their muscle condition that is paramount. It may be their learning difficulties or behavioral difficulties that we certainly see with our Becker muscular dystrophy boys. And so certainly a lot of our time, particularly my care advisor, and specialist nurses devoted to addressing that with the families, and going into school, helping to work with the schools, because these children very often will have specific learning needs, and will struggle particularly with very often their reading and writing abilities, and so very often they have to liaise with the schools to look at that. With Becker muscular dystrophy, unlike Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it can be very widespread and very heterogeneous, the presentation. So we do have children with Becker muscular dystrophy that then are limited from a more motor point of view. And again, sort of that needs a lot of input, particularly with schools, particularly as they're moving up into secondary school, and the schools get bigger and more demanding on the children. We do have a lot more input then, and particularly also with, games and PE, and trying to sort of make sure that they're included with that, and keep them active. And certainly, again, keeping them active. Again, my physiotherapists are very active with the kids, trying to engage them, and not necessarily giving them, sort of strict physio exercises, but actually generally trying to keep them active and find, sort of activities that they enjoy to keep them moving. And the other aspect is with the family as well. Whilst this is not Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it is a huge burden for the family, and a loss of their normal child, and for some families, I've had some families saying, oh, if it was muscular dystrophy, I knew I would know what to expect, because there is more of a definite timeline, but also there's a lot more research happening and a lot more trials for Becker muscular dystrophy. So families sometimes feel that whilst it's a potentially milder phenotype, they actually have less guidance and input and support outside. So I think that can be very difficult for them to deal with. And our psychologist works quite a lot with these families, in sometimes more than she does with our Duchenne patients, because there appears to be sort of more support for them, more family orientated meetings and parent meetings, and less of that for Becker muscular dystrophy, which I think can be difficult for them. And sort of as Federica says, they still have the issues with cardiac problems as well as respiratory, and that might be later on. But certainly we've had some young lads in their teenage years that have had significant cardiac issues, and we've had to sort of say, no, you can't go to the gym and do weights, and we've got to potentially put you on the cardiac transplant list. And this is huge for these boys who don't necessarily have much motor involvement, and become very disengaged with everything. So I think Becker muscular dystrophy in some respects can be more difficult for our young lads, particularly going through the teenage years, for them to deal with, compared to Duchenne muscular dystrophy in some respects.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm going to break with the format slightly and come straight back with a question actually to you, which is we've talked a lot throughout this series about all the conditions we cover are by their nature rare conditions, but it's just very interesting the point you make about perhaps families might have even heard of Duchenne before, or know a bit more about Duchenne, but maybe never heard of it. Often are you finding that when you're diagnosing and working with a family, they've never heard of Becker, and part of your role is to explain actually what it is in the first place as well?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's like Duchenne. Most families have not, do not know about it unless there's a family, history. And vast majority of our boys, there is no family history. And so, yes, trying to explain this to them can take years, actually, and we're always having to go back and revisit it. And obviously, when the boys get older and go into their teenage years, we have to talk to them and explain the situation, because they may have been diagnosed when they were younger, and they won't know anything about it apart from they come to the hospital every 6 to 12 months. But you then have to, when they're going through that transition period, which we start around about 14, is actually finding out what they understand by the condition. Obviously, that's more difficult if they've got learning difficulties and learning needs. But, you know, it's trying to go through with them what this means. And as I say, particularly for our boys that haven't got learning difficulties, but have significant cardiac issues, you know, and they can't see that, you know, they think that their muscles look fine, but they actually, you know, sort of can't see what's going on in their heart. And, you know, why have I got to start taking these drugs? You know, why have I got to stop going to the gym with my mates and doing weights? Because, you know, they've got significant cardiomyopathy, you know, is really difficult.
Thanks, Tracy. So yeah, turning to you now, Stefen. I wonder if you could just sort of pick up and talk about the support that you and the team provide around adults, and maybe that, I mean, and Tracy sort of spoke about that word transition. So maybe how does your service interact with the local sort of paediatric service, and how do patients sort of come through from the paediatric service into your adult service?
Rob, could you add any more bits to a single question? Right. So we'll start with the last thing that you said, which was transition. So we have had a transition set up for quite a long time now, and it was set up by my predecessor, Dr. Helen Jones. And so we meet as two whole teams, both our pediatric colleagues, care advisor, physiotherapist, and clinician, and the adult team. We have an MDT followed by the transition clinic, about 3, 4, 5 times a year, depending on patient need. So I mean, they're prepared for that well by our pediatric team, and actually that worked very well. I think Tracy has covered everything else pretty well, but what I would say in the adult service is that we see even more varied presentations of Becker muscular dystrophy than they do in the pediatrics, and therefore the care has to be it is in pediatrics, but it has to be even more so individualized in adults because of the heterogeneous nature of it. So in terms of our core team, obviously you've got Heather here, who herself and Jane do much more for the patients than I ever will do in our clinic. And the main issues for the patients is really navigating those care systems, work, social services, and this is what Heather and Jane do very well with them, to make sure they're getting access to what they need to maintain their independence and to have a full life. The other thing there's quite a lot of in the adult clinic, and I think some of it's still hidden quite a bit because people are unwilling to talk about it or don't wish to talk about it, is the reproductive issues as well, which we do quite a bit with that. And again, Heather is involved with that, and we liaise with our genetics team quite a lot regarding that. But otherwise, I think it's probably quite similar to what Tracy and her team do.
Thanks, Stefen. I'm going to be much more disciplined in my questions now from now on. I'll try my best. Heather, I wonder if I can come to you next. So Stefen mentioned your role as the care advisor. It'd just be really great if you could just talk through what that role comprises of and the kind of support that you would offer to patients and their families with Becker.
Well, the professionals up and down the country that fill this role can be from different backgrounds. So as you've quite rightly said, my background is nursing. It's 11 years I've been doing this job now. Your information's a little bit out of date. So I'm very pleased to say it's been 11 years I've been with this service. But my counterpart for the paediatric service, Rebecca Moore, is an occupational therapist. There are specialist nurses up and down the country that fulfill this role as well. And there are also physiotherapists. My predecessor was a social worker. So we all bring our own interests and expertise to this role. And that will obviously inform how we approach patients' needs. But yes, it can be very much signposting and advising people about where to go for services, or it might be direct referral to adult social care to get either an occupational therapy advice, assessment, or to get care advice. I'm very interested to know that care packages are working in the community, and if they're not, I will support the families or individuals to try and address what the problems are and smooth those out. Having a knowledge of the pattern of muscle weakness gives me it enables me to be able to do a good referral to occupational therapy. So quite often I'll do that for the patient, although patients can do that themselves, and I can advise OTs about what equipment might actually suit, rather than other equipment which they may not realise is unsuitable. It's a very varied role, and it can involve filling out benefit forms or directing people accordingly. And sometimes I say, whatever, just if it's just not medical or physio, it comes to me.
Thank you, Heather. I'm going to break with the format again. We've had a question really around sort of the psychological element of dealing with Becker. And Tracy, you mentioned it in your service. You have a dedicated psychologist, I think. I'm just wondering if Heather, is that an aspect that you have to support patients with as well? And then turn to Tracy in terms of how that works in terms of specialist neuromuscular psychologist.
Having a long-term relationship, being in a service for so long and getting to know these people so long actually enables good conversations and supportive conversations as we stay with those families for their duration with our service. But no, I'm not a psychologist. We don't have a dedicated service. We would like to, but we do have a service within the John Radcliffe that people could access if they're in Oxfordshire. Obviously, it's a wide area that we cover. And so really it's a matter of the GP referring them at our advice to their local psychology services. We do encourage people to use talking therapies, which some people really turn the nose up at. How can people possibly understand if they don't know my condition? But I think that the common features of a sense of loss or the grieving process or anger at the condition are common feeds throughout lots of different people's lives and life events. And I think it's worthwhile trying talking therapies. You can access it through the NHS website. And if it's anxiety that is particularly a difficulty for you, then we often recommend apps that you can download onto your phone, such as Headspace. And we get a lot of positive feedback about that.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, and that dedicated psychology role is something that MDUK is sort of campaigning for within neuromuscular services. And Tracy, am I right? I think you did say you do have a dedicated psychologist within your service. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, we do. And as Heather says, I mean, obviously, we have a huge list of patients, and both, my care advisor and specialist nurse have been to the sessions that the MDUK put on about, enabling them and trying to upskill, to help our patients. And as Heather says, our patients are with us, sort of for the long haul. And we get to know them really, really well. And, I find that, a lot of patients will hook onto certain sort of members of the team, and obviously it's like with all of us, we all click with different people, and we might not get on with somebody as well as we do with others. And so, we've tried to establish patient passports, which means that they have a key worker within the team. And that might not be the specialist nurse or the care advisor. It might be one of the physios, and it might not be the psychologist, but, sort of they've got that key worker that they can always contact to discuss anything. And our psychologist, she basically is part of our MDT, but is down in clinic with us as well. And bobs in to see, the patients wherever they're being seen, whether it's with me, whether it's one of my other consultant colleagues. And if there are ongoing issues, or if there are, sort of some psychological issues that are going on that is more severe and out of the sort of remit of us that can do a little bit of sort of talking therapy, then she will take them on and see them outside of the clinic. And that will be in a place of safety for them, whether that's at school or at college, whether it's at home in their own environment, or if it's, sort of at another place that is not the hospital and not their home, but a neutral ground. So, she's able to arrange that, and some of the young lads particularly, they quite like being seen in college, away from home in some respects, or on a neutral territory. Because they very often, particularly the older teenagers, have got issues that they want to discuss that they might not necessarily, want to discuss with their parents or their families. And so, sort of she is there as that sounding board and can go through things with them.
Great. Thanks both.
I was going to say it doesn't always mean that you know can help. You know, sometimes, you know, they don't want to engage, but, you know, sort of we always sort of offer that.
Thank you. John, I'm going to turn to you now. We heard from Federica in the research part around the sort of the effects of Becker on heart muscles, and Tracy's alluded to those discussions with teenagers in particular around the impact on heart. Could you just describe a bit about how your specialist support for people with Becker and kind of the treatment and support you provide?
Yeah, thanks very much. Federica has already set the stage very nicely for a discussion about the heart. And one of the key points that she highlighted, which is certainly borne out in practice, is the variability. And so unlike in Duchenne, for example, where it's quite easy to set up a kind of a protocol-driven arrangement whereby everyone will develop cardiomyopathy and therefore everyone can benefit from treatment started very early and prophylactically. In Becker, we have to be much, much more individualized in the approach. And I suppose it's already been highlighted, but just to re-emphasize it again, the young men, particularly the teenagers and younger adults that I really worry about are the ones with the very mild skeletal muscle phenotype who can have a disproportionately severe cardiomyopathy. And I suppose the point we constantly try to make to patients is, particularly in, I suppose, adolescents and the younger adults, when we all felt at the same age we were all immortal, that they do need to keep attending for periodic heart checks. And essentially we try to set that practice up from early on and reinforce it each time people attend. And the frequency of attendance, it's not that you want to overburden people with specialist clinics, because there's many other clinics, as we've heard, that people need to attend on a regular basis, and they get more obvious, perhaps to them, more obvious benefits. From the heart's point of view, the frequency of follow-up is largely dictated by what the previous set of heart checks showed and where they are in the kind of surveillance active treatment sort of level. So I guess the take-home message from the heart's point of view is that although the age of onset of detectable heart muscle weakness is highly variable for the genetic reasons that Federica has highlighted, the treatments are generic at the moment. So we have a whole range of heart-specific medications which are started and introduced in a staged fashion. Fortunately, they're very well tolerated by and large, so we don't have to worry about serious toxicity. And the question is what trigger you're going to use to start them. And that really hinges on the earliest possible detection of heart muscle weakness, whether it's actual weakness or even the stage before heart muscle weakness if you're using MRI of the heart for screening, for example. And more recently then, there's a range of additional heart medications which are increasingly justified as heart weakness is established. So not just ACE inhibitors, but things like sacubitril valsartan, Entresto, or some of the newer SGLT2 inhibitors, which are a new family of drugs for use in the heart. And I guess in major distinction with, say, Duchenne dystrophy, where we don't know whether there's any role for things like defibrillators or special kinds of pacemakers, or transplantation typically is ruled out for them. In Becker patients, especially if the phenotype in other respects is quite mild, all of these treatments remain on the menu and available to be deployed in a kind of an individualized patient discussion way at the right time. But the key thing really in my mind is that we want to detect the earliest trigger points for starting treatment, because if we start treatment promptly and escalate it in the right way, very, very few patients should end up needing things like transplantation or developing heart failure symptoms until way, way down the line when they're approaching perhaps even near normal life expectancy. So I think that's the important point. So I suppose I'd summarize by simply saying the heart is involved in approximately 70% of patients with Becker dystrophy. Untreated, it tends to progress and deteriorate. Symptoms have absolutely nothing to do with it. It's all about picking up with surveillance heart muscle weakness and treating it appropriately and aggressively enough. And basically the sky is the limit as regards treatment, unlike is the case for Duchenne.
Thanks, John. I think you answered one of the questions that came in advance, but we had a question from somebody ahead of the seminar just asking how often they should be having a cardiology appointment. It sounds like that's really down to what their last appointment showed and discussions with their specialist. Is that right?
Well, essentially, the general recommendation is to have an annual check. That's a little bit heavy-handed for some patients whose hearts are normal year after year. But you certainly don't want to be going more than 2 years without a repeat check. And again, it depends whether you're screening by MRI or echo. If you're screening by MRI, you'll get early pre-dysfunctional indications of heart involvement. And increasingly, MRI is the gold standard for screening. In the longer term, it may become possible to check for heart involvement with peripheral blood testing, looking at biomarkers and so on, which would make it an awful lot easier and allow more targeting of treatment, but also more targeting of the tests that are needed and how often they're needed. Thank you, John.
We've had an interesting question coming in around. We've spoken all about boys has been the word used. Do any women or girls are affected by Becker or as manifesting carriers? I don't know who is happy to take that question.
Yeah, well, in cardiac surveillance is advocated obviously for females who are shown to carry the Duchenne or Becker gene. There's a lot of debate at the moment as to whether the Becker female carriers are as much at risk. They probably aren't as much at risk of cardiomyopathy as the Duchenne carriers. But essentially, they also are advised periodic cardiac screening, and the frequency of screening is typically 3 to 5 years apart. And again, trying to persuade people and encourage them to attend for testing is quite an issue that needs reiteration, because many of these women have lost contact with the muscle teams because they don't have muscle symptoms, but also because perhaps sadly their boys who led to them being diagnosed are now dead. And therefore they perhaps drift away from health services or have lost contact with the people who are supporting them at an earlier stage.
Thank you, John. Tracy, you came off mic, I think. Have you got something to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, certainly, we do see some of the mothers, sort of who do have symptoms of our lads with Becker muscular dystrophy, but less so compared to Duchenne. But obviously it can happen. But the main thing is obviously we encourage them with the cardiac surveillance, and we do try and keep on top of that, because very often they'll go for a cardiac scan and then dismissed and discharged, and it's just trying to make sure that they have that knowledge that they should be seeing at least sort of maybe 3 to 5 years, and if they haven't got an appointment, come through to let us know, and then we liaise with the GP to sort of get another appointment for them. With our Duchenne muscular dystrophy mums, again, it's very similar with the cardiac side of things. It depends if they're actually plugged into one of our clinics that has, sort of the cardiologist with an interest, or who sees, sort of their sons, which obviously isn't our paediatric cardiologist, it's our adult cardiologist that we do joint clinics with. But yes, it can be quite difficult, but certainly we do see some manifesting.
Thank you. Stefen, you want to come in here as well?
Yeah, I just want to say that the questioner is entirely correct in a way, and this is one of the major problems with medical terminology. It is particularly rigid, and it is useful medically sometimes to describe someone as having Duchenne, Becker muscular dystrophy, because it describes a particular clinical pattern or severity. But it also shows the problem with such rigid terminology, and whether we need in the future for people's understanding to move to terms such as dystrophinopathies and describe them in terms of their severities. That's all.
Thanks, Stefen. I've got a question probably that it sticks with you and Tracy, actually. It was just, and again, it's sort of a bit of a comparison with Duchenne, which is around, are steroids used in the same way for patients with Becker as they are with patients with Duchenne? I don't know who wants to take that first.
I'm going to hand that to you, Tracy, seeing you hand us the patients on the steroids.
Yes, we do use steroids with Becker muscular dystrophy, but not as frequent as Duchenne. So it very much is clinical need driven, because obviously there's huge side effects with steroids. You know, whilst there's quite a lot of papers out there about using steroids in Becker muscular dystrophy, I think it's not to be taken, you know, sort of lightly, really. I mean, I've certainly used it in one of my lads who I would have said, you know, very often we talk about, as Stefen says, a dystrophinopathy is on a spectrum, particularly with Becker muscular dystrophy. Obviously, you've got your severe Duchenne's, but some of our Beckers can be, you know, very severe, you know, and almost sort of tipping over into that sort of Duchenne territory. And I think, you know, if we want to try and keep our lads, you know, sort of ambulant for as long as possible, then, you know, we do have that discussion. I had one young lad who really wanted to preserve his ambulation going through sort of sixth form and getting to university. And so we did, you know, start him on steroids, and he, you know, responded very well to them. And it got him through sort of his sixth form and into university. But then, you know, sort of over time, he has become non-ambulant, and, you know, we're coming off the steroids now because he doesn't like the appearance. And he hasn't been on them for as long as, you know, sort of we've had, you know, our Duchenne patients on them for that. And certainly, you know, we started older, you know, sort of adults when I was in Newcastle on steroids, particularly if they've had a sudden deterioration in their sort of motor skills. But yes, it's not as widespread, and I think that's also because of, you know, the side effects that we do see with the steroids are not, you know, sort of minimal, really. I would always say as well, you know, this one case that we started on steroids, interestingly, we did end up finding another muscle condition with this young man as well, or a carrier of another muscle condition. So I always think, you know, if you have got a severe phenotype, you know, always think, well, is there something else as well that might be contributing? You know, because I think, you know, that's something always to consider from a clinical perspective.
And I've had a question in actually about steroids as we've been talking, and this may be more for you, because it's come from an adult who says that they're still ambulant, but is feeling a change. And how would they have a conversation with their clinical team about trialing the use of steroids?
So I may regret this because this is one of my patients. To bring it up with them, I would just bring it up at their clinic appointment or contact their team. I mean, we're very contactable. Heather and Jane always know where I am, unfortunately. I have to say, in the adult world, I have not yet commenced anyone on steroids, on glucocorticoids for management of their condition. And we don't tend to see big step changes. You know, there is obviously slow progression over time. You know, majority of our patients don't change significantly year on year. Once they've gone through puberty, things tend to slow down dramatically. Often the appreciation of what's happening can be sudden change, but it's usually more the patient has tipped over a functional threshold than there being a significant clinical deterioration. So as of yet, it's not a conversation we've had to have in our clinic, but it's not a conversation that we would not be willing to have or would shy away from having with patients. Obviously, with steroids and a slowly progressive condition, particularly in the adult population, there are significant side effects that have to be borne in mind. And it is really then to determine how long you're going to continue or try the steroids for. You know, what is the optimum point? Where will you draw the line to say this has been successful or unsuccessful and to stop it? And that's going to be very, very difficult to determine.
Thank you. Tracy, I'm going to come to you because of something you said as we joined in the session earlier. We had a question of answer around accessing clinical trials. And I think you said immediately prior to this session, you were with a patient who was on a clinical trial. So the question was, how can someone find out about clinical trials and be sort of put forward for them, as it were, or be known to the people running the trials?
Yes, I was going to say, yeah, but this was for a Duchenne trial. Now we've got a lot of, obviously a lot of trials going on at the moment, which have picked up again following COVID for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, not so with Becker muscular dystrophy. With regards to sort of trials, I suppose it's, you know, best to be on the registry, you know, sort of, and that's important to register. There are sort of some trials going on, sort of looking at, certainly with Duchenne and Becker, looking at sort of brain MRI in the dystrophinopathies, which obviously isn't a treatment trial, but it's looking at trying to understand the conditions a little bit more, which is recruiting. You can always look on the clinicaltrials.gov.uk website, where you can put in Becker muscular dystrophy and search there. There are some trials. I think there's a phase 1 trial going on in the US at the moment for Becker muscular dystrophy, but it is just phase 1. That's looking at safety and tolerability in both healthy adults, and it is an adult trial. And I think that's looking at sort of, sounds like an antifibrotic sort of compound that, you know, looks at reducing sort of fibrosis and in the muscle. So potentially that might be a trial that, you know, once it's gone through phase 1, you know, may open up. I think they're recruiting in Texas at the moment. But yes, you know, sort of, I think, you know, it is very difficult at the moment because there is so much going on with Duchenne, but I would hope that some of that work will then translate to our Becker muscular dystrophy patients. You know, and we've just had the first, you know, sort of, we're just starting with the gene therapy here in the UK with Pfizer, and dosed the first boy back in May with gene therapy. So, you know, there is that potential that, you know, we then may move to looking at Becker muscular dystrophy. But I would encourage, yes, to stay engaged with your neuromuscular team, but also sort of the registry as well.
And in terms of the registry, is that something patients have to opt into, or does that happen naturally as part of their sort of care from the specialist team?
No, it is an opt-into, you know, because they have to consent to go on the registry, but, you know, we tend to give families the information about it. And I suppose, you know, that's something we as clinicians should probably do more of, is reminding, you know, families that they can be part of this. And obviously sort of events like this, MDUK, you know, sort of Becker and Duchenne patient days, you know, sort of, whilst although Action Duchenne is more, you know, aimed at Duchenne, you know, you can be looking there as well to sort of see what's coming up in particular.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. John, we've had a question sort of coming in live that I think is certainly for you, which is around the questions around is there a bigger risk about sleeping and heart complications with Becker? Is there what's the link there? Is that a common concern?
There is a link, but it's, if I understand the question correctly, it's if you have hypoventilation or reduced inadequate breathing overnight, then your system is going to rev furiously to try and protect you. And some of the revving that goes on will cause a deterioration of the heart if the heart is at that stage where it's going to deteriorate. So, you know, for example, even leaving aside muscle conditions, if you get a lot of pouring out of revving substances in the body, hormones and so on, you will develop a cardiomyopathy, like an endocrine tumor, for example, or if you have a stress-related cardiomyopathy. These are conditions that are nothing to do with muscle disease, but you can see how the overlap works too. If your heart is vulnerable and you're in a very stressed situation because you're routinely underventilating at night and that hasn't been detected, then you can see how it can accelerate a cardiomyopathy in its development and bring forward something that might not be so obvious for some time later.
Thank you.
I don't know if that actually addresses what was in the mind of the questioner, but
well, I'm sure they can come back on the Q&A if they want some further clarification. That's really helpful. Thanks, John. We've also had a question come through. I'm conscious this may be one we have to take away, but I don't know if any of the panelists have got a view on this. A question around whether there's a role for sort of stem cell treatment, and whether that's being looked at all for Becker. Has anyone got a view on that, or is that something we will take away and come back to the questioner? Looks like we'll come back to you. So sorry about that. I did warn people. I do always try and warn people that we may not be able to cover everything. So that's great. Thank you. Just looking at our other questions we had in advance. I think there was, Heather, I think there's a sense for you, someone contacted us in advance just around the sense of being overwhelmed about a diagnosis and kind of the impact of Becker. Do you work with children and families, and is that something that you sort of help people unpack, that sense of being overwhelmed and sort of breaking it down a bit into kind of what support might be available?
Not personally, because I'm with the adult service, but my colleague Rebecca Moore most certainly will. What I wanted to urge that person, if it's not obvious, if you've had a clinic letter from that first diagnostic appointment, you should have the details of all the people in that team, including a care advisor, if there is one attached to that team, and you can use that number to contact them. Because some people may have a diagnosis in a general clinic with the paediatrician that will be running the muscle service, but then they're waiting for their first appointment actually to see the full team, and they can feel very much cast adrift, and it's a stage where they feel lost. So Rebecca will try and pick up on that. Also, MDUK have the list of all the care advisors in the country. I think I'm correct in saying some of the services don't have a care advisor sitting directly with the clinics, but they are covering that region, which may again be that the family may not realise this and not have access to them as soon as they need to. So perhaps it can investigate that either through the administrator for the paediatrician that made the diagnosis, or through MDUK, they could direct them. But yes, Rebecca Moore comes from a CAMS background, so she's very much interested in family therapy, and she's doing a family therapy course, and it very much centres her care around the family, how the family are coping, how do they cope, what's their way of coping, and then how can we use that to help them support their child and support each other.
Thank you, Heather. That's great. I'm going to say this is the final question, because that normally then means about 3 or 4 more come in. But for now, this is the final question. I'd be really interested in hearing from each of you, actually, just about how your role has changed over the past sort of 12 to 18 months, and how the service has adapted to the restrictions around COVID. John, I'm going to come to you first, simply because in the first week of the pandemic, we received a call from somebody who said they'd received a letter that their MRI scan would take place over the phone, which we thought was a rather strange innovation. So it'd be interesting to hear kind of what has actually really happened in terms of being able to, what support you can give remotely, and how the service is adapted that you provide.
It's probably interesting to think back to before COVID. Before COVID, we were trying to have all the heart tests done on the same day as they would attend the clinic. But if you think about it, by the time you have your ECG or your echo or whatever else, that was taking about 3 hours turnaround time, the way it was set up, and that was even with echo in the clinic. And it wasn't very efficient for patients, even though it didn't seem that way to us at the time. With COVID, of course, face-to-face reviews ceased. And the model now is that the clinic is run virtually for almost everyone, with the tests done separately. And this works very well for patients we already know. And in fact, I suspect, based on some comments, but it's not a formal assessment, that patients and families prefer that. So we have a kind of it's always been a family-friendly clinic in that sense that, you know, mums who are being screened for their hearts and their younger children, and then as they move into adulthood, if there's two boys of the same age or slightly of different ages, then it's a bit of a mess if one is seen in a pediatric clinic, one is seen in an adult clinic. But the model then that we have now seems to be better, and I suspect we'll probably continue this, where the tests are done as standalone, and then within a week or two of that, you have a discussion by phone with the family. And from where we're at the moment, that seems both preferred by patients and it works quite smoothly for us as well. So that would be my learning point from the COVID pandemic.
I almost got through one session without doing that, talking on mute, but I failed there. Thanks, John. Tracy, in terms of the paediatric service, how have you? We've heard in other sessions that it can be quite challenging to get children to sort of concentrate in front of a screen if you need to have a sort of an appointment with a child. But have you found that? And in terms of how has your service adapted to restrictions, and are you opening back up fully to face-to-face now?
Yes, I mean, we're fully face-to-face and have been since probably about a year now. But yes, you know, sort of it's been interesting. It's been a learning curve. So we've done a combination of things. You know, sort of for some of our patients, you know, it's just been a discussion with the parents if the children are really very young. But we have also managed to do sort of North Star ambulatory assessments over the video. And we did a nice little study. Two of my physios sort of set up a study with 10 of our patients. And, you know, they were pre-warned they were going to be doing their North Star. And we sent them all the instructions, and even my psychologist sort of sent out some little paper cones that they could make and decorate so that they could put those for their 10-meter runs. The physio scored them independently. So it was at the same time, but they were on different laptops scoring and actually got very, very similar scores for them. So it, you know, demonstrated to us that we could, you know, sort of do those assessments over the video. You know, for some of our youngsters, yeah, they would come on for some of the video and then they would leave their parents to do the rest of it. And so you'd get the important things, you know, sort of out of the way and sort of have a chat with them. But I suppose it also opened up doing a bit more remote sort of monitoring. So we managed to sort of secure funding for some Bluetooth spirobanks banks. So that we could send those out for the children to do their respiratory function, their FECs. And they quite like them because they're quite small, you know, sort of little gizmos that talks to their smartphone. There's an app that they download on their smartphone, and you would get them to send them in every month. And it's a nice little PDF with their predicted sort of FEC on, which is quite nice. And so we can save that to their hospital records, but also they've got a record of it themselves, which certainly the older children and the family quite like to see. And again, with sort of monitoring their heart for some of our older sort of patients as well, you know, we sent out sort of cardiac monitor to do sort of, you know, 24, 48-hour monitoring. And initially we sort of wondered how they would manage. We had sort of a live feed, you know, for the first one when we sent it out, that they could contact us and we'd be on video to talk them through it. But actually, they managed it absolutely fine. You know, we sort of pulled together a sort of a crib sheet for them, and we had that tested with one of our non-medical husbands to see if he could put the heart monitor on our specialist nurse, and he managed very well. And then also we were gifted a Tosca sort of overnight study as well, which again, you know, has been fantastic for those that we needed to get sleep studies on, that we could send out. Either we would drop it off if it was local, but if not local, as we cover a huge area, we couriered it out to the families again with a sort of crib sheet that they could put the monitor on at night when the children went to bed, so that we could get their sleep study. So I think it's opened up quite a lot of, you know, possibilities of remote, you know, sort of monitoring as well, that we don't need to do everything in hospital, which I think is a positive.
Thanks, Tracy. And Stefen, in terms of sort of an adult service, is there a similar story in terms of things you've been able to identify that can be done remotely and delivering those? And what's the state of the service at the moment?
So the service is, apart from I think about a month back, March of last year, the service has been fully open for face-to-face appointments. So what I would say, though, one good thing after the pandemic has now been the option to offer patients either a video call or a telephone call or a face-to-face appointment, and they can pick. And we do the telephone calls in our clinic at the with the MDT team there, the same with the video calls as well. So, and I think our patients really appreciate that variety, because they, from year to year, as I alluded to earlier, they will not, many of them will not change significantly, and they don't want to have to have a family outing to cope with the parking issues at Oxford. So they're quite happy to do a video appointment. So I think we've been wanting to offer this to patients for quite some time. So it's absolutely fantastic that now we can offer this. In terms of things like the respiratory, we've always had the ability to send those out to patients. We just have greater capacity to do so now. So despite all the terrible things that have happened, the pandemic has had significant benefits to our patient population, which I'm personally very happy about, and I do not see them changing in the near future.
Thanks, Stefen. And Heather, in terms of your role, you've spoken a few times about the importance of building relationships with the people you support. Has that been sort of hampered a bit by the pandemic, or actually were you often in touch with families anyway over through phone calls and video calls?
I think it was pretty much business as usual, really. I think it's having a long relationship with patients made it easier to talk about issues that they were having. So yeah, I think what I can bring away from it was just literally a gargantuan kick at the bum to actually get savvy with all the tech and be more intimately acquainted with EPR. And yeah, I just echo what Stefen said. It's been great to be able to offer the what we call the Attend Anywhere video service. What I chuckle at is that those first few weeks, when we're wondering what's going to be happening, so many of our patients were way ahead of the government and our own advice about lockdown. They were already bringing their children out of school and isolating, and we were thinking it's a bit extreme. And then within weeks, it was like everyone's locked down and everyone's bringing their children out of school. So it was a great learning experience for us. Yeah, I think a lot of the issues that I was dealing with in the first place were simple things like I can't get logged on to being a recipient for home delivery for supermarkets. I can't get registered. It's little things like that, but we're making a huge difference to people. So yeah, just a new set of problems which we've dealt with accordingly. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. That draws us to a close this morning. So thank you very much to our panelists for such a fascinating session. So thanks to John, Heather, Tracy, Stefen and Federica. And thanks also to those of you who've joined us to watch the session and have fed in questions. I'd like to say thank you also to our sponsors, PTC Therapeutics and Roche. And a reminder that this session, the recording of it will be available on the MDUK website over the next day or so, along with all the other sessions we've had so far this year. So we've had some condition-specific sessions like this, but we've also had sessions on accessing benefits and financial advice, on education, and there's ones coming up on employment and things like that. So do take a look at those sessions. So yeah, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you've found the session useful. Thank you very much for your time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.